Highway of Tears. The dimly lit highway stretched endlessly through the vast wilderness of British Columbia, cutting through dense forests and sprawling landscapes. Highway 16, often referred to as the Highway of Tears, was a lifeline connecting remote Indigenous communities. Yet, beneath its picturesque facade, this highway concealed a sinister and heartbreaking mystery. The story of the Highway of Tears begins not in the 21st century, but much earlier, in the late 1960s. Indigenous communities had inhabited these lands for centuries, living off the land, practicing their traditions, and maintaining a close connection with their ancestral territory. But the tranquility of these communities was shattered when young Indigenous women and girls started vanishing without a trace. In 1969, the first ominous chapter of this tragic saga was written. Indigenous woman Gloria Moody, 26, was on a road trip with her family on that fateful evening. During their stay, she and her brother had plans to enjoy a night out in town. They visited several bars that evening, including the Lakeview, the Maple Leaf, and Ranch Hotel. Ranch Hotel was the last establishment they attended. When they decided it was time to call it a night, Dave left the bar to return to their hotel room, assuming Gloria was following him. However, when he looked back, she had disappeared, and he had no knowledge of her whereabouts from that point onward. The following day, two hunters were exploring a cattle trail approximately 10 kilometers west of Williams Lake when they discovered the body of a woman in the bush. Law enforcement later confirmed the victim's identity as Gloria. She had been forcibly stripped, her clothes discarded nearby, and she had suffered severe physical assault and sexual abuse. Tragically, Gloria had succumbed to her injuries, leading to her tragic death. Gloria's tragic case is often regarded as the first known case of the Highway of Tears. Following her death and the subsequent recognition of this concerning pattern of unsolved murders and disappearances along the same highway, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police established a specialized task force named EPANA. This task force was formed with the primary objective of investigating and addressing the series of unsolved cases along the Highway of Tears, seeking justice for the victims and their families. As the 1970s dawned, more Indigenous women and girls would go missing or meet grisly fates along the same desolate stretch of road. Their stories often followed a distressingly similar pattern. They were last seen hitchhiking, attempting to travel to nearby towns or cities for work, school, or social reasons. Then, they vanished. The early years of these disappearances were marked by confusion, grief, and despair. Families were left grappling with the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. The police response in those early days was, at best, inadequate. Limited resources, lack of coordination between jurisdictions, and the remoteness of the area contributed to the difficulties in solving these cases. The 1970s had come and gone, But the Highway of Tears continued to weave its dark tapestry of disappearances and deaths. By the 1980s, the number of Indigenous women and girls who had gone missing or been murdered along this desolate highway had grown significantly. It was a grim pattern, one that could no longer be ignored. The Highway of Tears stretched approximately 450 miles, connecting small Indigenous communities to larger towns and cities in British Columbia. While the highway itself was a lifeline for transportation, it had become a symbol of pain and suffering for the Indigenous communities that relied on it. Over the years, it became clear that the impact of these tragedies was not equally distributed. Indigenous communities bore the brunt of this systemic tragedy, as the vast majority of victims were Indigenous women and girls. Each victim had a unique story, a life cut short and a family left in anguish. Their stories were as diverse as the communities they came from. There were young girls aspiring to be teachers, mothers trying to provide for their children, and sisters who had dreams and aspirations. The victims were more than just statistics. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. Their stories are a testament to the profound loss experienced by their families and communities. As the number of cases grew, so did the scrutiny on the police response to these disappearances and murders. Families and advocates questioned the lack of resources, coordination, and urgency in solving these cases. Many believe that racism and stereotypes played a significant role in how law enforcement and society as a whole responded to these tragedies. Indigenous women and girls often faced stigma and bias, which hindered effective investigations and support. The haunting tragedies along the Highway of Tears could not remain hidden forever. As the 1990s dawned, families, friends, and advocates began to raise their voices, determined to bring attention to the disappearances and murders plaguing their communities. It was a cry for justice and change that would resonate far beyond the remote stretches of Highway 16. The families of the victims, often left to grapple with the anguish of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, joined together in a quest for answers. They formed support groups, shared information, and offered each other solace in the face of unimaginable grief. The strength of their collective resolve was a testament to the resilience of Indigenous communities. Simultaneously, Indigenous leaders and activists, recognizing the urgent need to address this crisis, began to organize and advocate for action. The Native Women's Association of Canada, among others, took up the cause, drawing national and international attention to the Highway of Tears. Their tireless efforts aimed to shed light on the systemic issues that allowed these tragedies to persist. The term Highway of Tears was coined during a vigil held in Terrace, British Columbia in 1998. Florence Naziel, the individual responsible for coining the phrase, came up with it while reflecting on the grief experienced by the families of the victims. Notably, a A significant portion of the individuals on the list of victims are Indigenous women, highlighting a troubling and disproportionate trend in the cases along this highway. This has drawn attention to the broader issue of violence and vulnerability faced by Indigenous women in Canada. The pressure on the Canadian government to respond to this growing crisis continued to mount. Indigenous leaders, families, and advocates called for a national inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, arguing that it was essential to examine the root causes of these tragedies and provide a path forward for justice and change. Attention also played a crucial role in raising awareness about the Highway of Tears. Documentaries, news reports, and investigative journalism brought the stories of the victims and their families to a broader audience. The power of storytelling and the human faces behind the statistics began to pierce the veil of indifference. In 2016, their persistence paid off. The Canadian government established the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, acknowledging the gravity of the issue and the need for a comprehensive investigation. The inquiry aimed to gather testimony from survivors, families, and experts, with the goal of understanding the systemic factors contributing to these tragedies and making recommendations for action. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, established in response to years of advocacy and pressure, marked a significant turning point in the fight for justice along the Highway of Tears. This comprehensive inquiry, which spanned from 2016 to 2019, sought to unravel the systemic issues that had allowed these tragedies to persist and to provide a roadmap for change and accountability. As the inquiry unfolded, its findings and recommendations began to shed light on the complex web of factors contributing to the Highway of Tears' enduring tragedy. The stories and testimonies of survivors and families took center stage, laying bare the pain and suffering experienced by Indigenous communities for decades. The inquiry's report, released in 2019, was a landmark moment. It detailed the systemic causes and consequences of violence against Indigenous women and girls, highlighting the role of colonialism, racism, sexism, and poverty in perpetuating this crisis. The report's findings were both heartbreaking and infuriating, but they also provided a roadmap for action. However, the work was far from over. Unsolved cases continued to haunt communities along the Highway of Tears. Families persisted in their demand for answers and justice, and advocacy groups remained vigilant, ensuring that the promises made in response to the inquiry were kept. The fight for accountability and change was ongoing, and the road ahead remained challenging. To this day, a lot of questions remained unanswered in the stories of the victims, their families, and the tireless advocates continue to serve as a reminder that the Highway of Tears is not just a stretch of road. It is a symbol of the enduring fight for justice and the hope for a safer and more equitable future for Indigenous women and girls. And with that, we have come to the end of our video. Please don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and click that notification bell. This is Ben saying, see you next time.